The review you're about to watch begins in 3, 2. Hey everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. I shouldn't say it too loud. I don't know who's going to attack me. But I hope you guys are kind to me in the comments here as I talk about A Quiet Place Day One. This is a review as part of my summer catch-up series where I'm doing a new review every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the month of August, catching up on the summer movies I haven't talked about on the channel. And a lot of movies, it's very interesting. I've given some time to a lot of these, and my opinions have both risen and fallen for some of these movies, and Quiet Place Day One is no exception. There are certain elements I really like more now that I've thought about them, and there are elements that I think have not necessarily aged particularly well in just a few weeks since I saw it that I've kind of reflected on. I'm like, that doesn't work. That really doesn't work. But that's what's so fun about like doing these reviews, especially now in August, a few months removed from when this came out, for example, that I get to kind of reflect on it in a little bit of retrospect, which is really interesting. We just finished our 10-year retrospective on the channel. So if you want to check out all those videos, I recently did an Oscars, basically where I picked the awards. It's the Pickle Awards for 2014, if you want to check that video out. But talking about Quiet Place Day One and talking about horror as a whole, I mean, it's very interesting with horror because you kind of have to judge it in different areas. A horror film, you have to judge it on the entertainment of the horror itself. Like, how much does it scare you? And even if it's not scaring you, are the scares still inventive? Are they thrilling? Are they engaging? You also have to think about the story outside of the horror. Does it work as its own kind of piece? If you don't have any scares, does it still work, or does it need those scares to be successful? And can it exist as its own great unique thing? And then there's that third element, which is specific to horror especially, but what does it mean? What does it stand for? What kind of lessons and morals are we meant to kind of take away from this thing? And also, what does the horror represent? And I think that's kind of one of the biggest things that's lingering on my mind when it comes to Day One, and kind of the Quiet Place franchise, or trilogy I should say, in general, is this idea of like, what are these monsters and what do they mean? Because now 3 films in and we still really don't know why they're there or what they're there for necessarily. I guess they're there to kill people, but like, what do they represent? What do they mean? And we'll talk about that in a second as well. But this is the follow-up to the last 2 Quiet Place films, directed by John Krasinski. This one is directed by Michael Cernowski, even though John Krasinski does have a hand in the production of this thing, and I believe the writing as well. But this is a very different tonal pivot. Obviously, Michael Cernowski just came off of Pig, a very pensive, kind of character-driven piece, and he definitely takes a lot of that into this film as well, because this centers around Lupita Nyong'o, who is a terminally ill, I believe it's a cancer patient, who basically doesn't have much time to live, and now this whole catastrophe happens. I mean, it is quite literally day one of this apocalyptic event. The day one we kind of saw a little bit of in Quiet Place Part 2, but this is like all taking place right at the start of this mania. It's actually like week 1, if you will, because it takes place over a few days. So the title might be a little bit misleading, but you kind of follow this woman's journey as someone who is dying and what that means for her in this context of this apocalypse where everyone is struggling to survive. And she's just trying to figure out, what am I going to do with the time I have left? Because she knows her time is already running out as is. And I think that's a really interesting approach to take to a story like this, especially when we get to the horror itself. The fact that the horrors and scares are genuinely the same thing every time. It's, you make a noise, they come attack you, and there's only so much you can do with that. And I think that's the first area I want to touch on, is the horror. And I think the horror here is where I think this franchise is already starting to run a little stale. And that's not to say there aren't thrilling moments. That isn't to say that the audience is not going to be at the edge of their seats waiting for a sound to happen. That's not to say everyone's going to stop eating their popcorn because they're anxious to make a noise. I mean, that is all still true. The audience I watched this with was very engaged. There wasn't a lot of noise, not a lot of texting, not a lot of chit chat, because they understood the assignment. They understood that this is a movie where you want to just be silent and kind of play along. And that's always been kind of the appeal of the Quiet Place movies. But I also think with that, because the monsters are still the same as the past 2, which is fair. I mean, that's this franchise's monsters. But because they basically kind of attack the same way every time, it kind of becomes a little stale. Like, you can kind of predict what's going to happen. You're like, oh, there's going to be a noise. Oh, yep, there is. And now the alien is attacking them. So I think from a horror perspective, I was waiting for a bit of an evolution here. But because this is also day one, they feel like they can't really evolve these monsters because they are the very base level monsters that we get. but they are the monsters we see in the first two parts. So if you love the horror from the first two, I don't necessarily know if this one is going to surprise. And this is something that I have kind of detracted on um, upon reflection. I really, really liked some of the scares when I first saw it, but now looking back, I can't really think of one off the top of my head that was like a memorable scare in the way that I can think of those iconic moments from the first two films. You know, the first one, especially with the bathtub and Emily Blunt, you know, going into labor in the bathtub and all the, you know, monster kind of like lurking in the house, almost like a stalker, almost like a slasher film. Like that is the stuff I remembered. I don't think this film has any iconic like horror moments in that way. I think some of the recycled lore of like, oh, waiting till really heavy rainfall to make noise, similarly to the first film where John Krasinski's talking to his kids under a waterfall. You know, it just kind of reuses the same beats over and over in terms of the horror that I felt like this one I could start to feel it getting a little bit stale. But now where I think Quiet Place Day One really shines is in the character development. This is what I alluded to earlier. Michael Cernoski coming on board, you know, with this really great mentality of this character drama, you know, being someone who really gets into the crux of humanity and what it means to be dying, but to live in the moment, even despite the fact that your time is running out. I think all that is done really well. And I think Lupita Nyong'o is the reason why this film works as good as it does. And I think Michael Cernoski's direction in those more humane, less horrified, blockbuster-fied moments is really where the film succeeds the most. And there's some really amazing moments. The fact that the climax of this thing has nothing to do with the monsters, but is simply these two characters, Lupita Nyong'o's character and Joseph Quinn's character, a character who I don't think gets a ton of really special things to do in this film. He really merely serves as like a supporting aid to her in her dramatic moments and her dramatic, you know, kind of realizations and revelations throughout the film. I think the cat has a lot more to do and more personality than Joseph Quinn in this film. But Joseph Quinn's going to have a fine few years. He's going to be in Fantastic Four. He still has the Stranger Things hive, kind of rooting for him and looking forward to everything he does next. He's going to be in Gladiator 2, which I think is going to get a lot of Oscar nominations. So he's going to be just fine. This one I think is going to be one of those roles where we're like, oh yeah, he was in a Quiet Place movie. I kind of forgot. What was his character again? And since this movie's come out, they've also confirmed that this character is gay, but there's really not a lot of meat on that bone either in this film because I feel like they really gloss over a lot of his backstory. Again, in service of her, who has the more complete story arc, because we see her quite literally before this whole apocalypse happens. We see her in her element. You know, she's kind of down on her luck. She decides to go with this group to this theater in the city, not because she wants to see this puppet play, even though I think the puppet show is really interesting. It kind of adds a little bit of creepy atmosphere because I'm a little bit afraid of puppets. But she agrees to go in the city because she wants to get a slice of pizza. And everyone's kind of like, okay, you can get pizza. And then, of course, when this whole outbreak happens, she really just still wants her pizza. She wants her pizza. She wants her pizza. And it becomes kind of like a bit of a gag. But once you realize what that pizza means and what the actual symbolism and what the history behind this pizza place in particular means to her character, it's actually quite stunning. I mean, this is what the kind of climax of the film builds to, as I was saying. There's just this tender moment spent between her and Joseph Quinn in this empty bar and what transpires there. It's a really beautiful moment. And I think that's where I left the theater being like, this was such a cool take on this story because so much of it is the horror from the first two. It's all trying to escape this monster. And there are character moments, but it all feels so connected to the actual monsters themselves. Whereas this one, it really just felt like she was going on her own personal journey. And this was merely a backdrop. The horror was a backdrop for her own self-discovery and her own realization of what she wanted to do with her last few minutes and days on Earth. And I thought that was really, really, really impactful. I think it's kind of the best stuff of Pig is like also the best stuff that we see in here, even though I think Pig is all that. Whereas here, I think it's a little bit muddled by some of the horror elements and also some of the CGI. I think the CGI in this film is pretty bad. But again, I do think the character moments are so beautiful that I don't necessarily mind all the kind of more stale horror beats, the more blockbuster like moments, because there was such great character work done there. And then this final kind of element I was talking about, like what the monsters represent. This is kind of where I've really started to question whether or not I like this film a lot, because it's clear they only have really one thing. They attack people that make sound. But like, what are they there for? Who sent them? Where did they come from? That's stuff that I think they could explore with more movies. And I don't think we even really need the answers to it. I think a lot of the fun is the mystery, but what does it actually mean in the context of symbolism? What does being quiet have to say about humanity at large in the way that so many other films use their horror to teach lessons? And I really don't know what the case is there. For example, Godzilla, probably the most famous one. He represents like nuclear bombs. Like that is a very clear metaphor. But even if you want to go a little bit more under the surface, I mean, The Fly, a film that reflected the AIDS epidemic at the time and the way people reacted to people who got AIDS and the way it kind of affected your communication with people around you. I mean, look at the xenomorphs from Alien, literally looking like male reproductive organs, and what that has to say about the overall theme of sex, especially with Ripley being this woman in like this man's world. What this all has to say. I mean, there's definitely something in an allegory with like sexual assault and reproduction there because of that, and that very intentional imagery of making these xenomorphs look like penises. I mean, you look at Cloverfield. This came out shortly after 9/11, and it has a very much big effect on like that kind of style of filmmaking post 9/11, where everything was kind of in a spot in response to that. The Predator, all about Vietnam, same thing. It was very culturally appropriate for the time, like to be telling stories about Vietnam, but this was a very different way to do so. Body Snatchers was about communism. The Thing is just generally about paranoia. Again, it doesn't go much deeper, but it is still about something. It still shows how people react when there's paranoia at large, and distrust, and all this manipulation between people, or this false manipulation in their minds. Again, all these horror films seem like their villains have something to say about society at large, or representing something, whereas here the monsters just represent don't make noise. But I also don't know why not making noise is like something we should all strive to do. Like, I think we should be free to speak and free to enjoy ourselves and have fun parties with our friends and make noise. And like, I just don't know what this film is trying to teach, trying to say with its horror. And I think that's where I'm mostly frustrated, because at least the first two films, and this film included, the characters go through a lot and the characters have a lot to go through, but it never feels directly connected to speech or silence. Like, I feel like a little bit in the first two films with the deaf girl, like I think that was very interesting because it deals with communication when you can't speak. But in this case, like Lupita Nyong'o's character, the fact that she can or can't speak really doesn't change the growth of her character. Like, what she realizes is important in the world, it really doesn't affect her at all. The whole nature of the atmosphere of being silent versus making noise. So it's just very interesting, and it's kind of lingered on my mind. And they're all just nitpicks because, again, I've had time to really think about this film. And there are a lot of people who love this film. I think if you're a cat lover, especially, you're going to love some of the horror, even though I think it is also stressful as a cat lover to see this cat almost in peril the whole time. But I will tell you right now, and this might be a spoiler alert, but I'm going to say it right now for all you people who are weary about it, the cat makes it out alive. So that's like a very good plus. That's a great thing. But I really just think at this point now we're three films in, and I really just wish the next film, if they make another one, I assume they will, I think it should just dive deeper into the mythology, not necessarily answering all the questions of what this alien is, but at least try to find something to say through this alien invasion and this apocalypse, and what it actually means in the context of the events of the apocalypse and the aliens, more so than just like the characters that are being affected. In this case, Lupita Nyong'o's character, who has a great journey, but again, I just don't think it has anything to really do with the actual nature of the world and being quiet. It's more so survival in general at large, but that can be applied to anything. A zombie movie, you could have the same movie happen if it's zombies. You know, the fact that it's silence doesn't really change the fact that she is trying to find what her life and what that meaning of life is with the little time she has left. So I just think that's something that I hope they expand upon in future installments. Now, the thing is, I don't hate this film. I find it enjoyable. I do think the character arcs are good, at least Lupita Nyong'o's character arc. I think the actual opening and how it sets the scene is really interesting, how it kind of builds to this like big apocalyptic event. I like the Digimon Hansu little cameo because he's in the second film, so you kind of can get a little bit of connective tissue with the universe in this thing. I do like how the monsters are designed. I think that CGI is done well, the actual creatures, even though I think like the rendering of all the different visual effects, like all the smoke effects and the fire, I think that doesn't look that great. And again, the scares, they work because, you know, it's fun to share an experience where everyone's in the theater holding their breath, not wanting to make noise, but it's all the stuff we've seen before. Like, I think the first two films just had better scares, had better moments. But I do think Michael Sarnowski in general is just a better director than a lot of other horror, you know, franchise direct for hire directors. So I really do think there is a lot to be loved about this film, but also a lot that I think does deserve some criticism, which is why I've kind of fluctuated between loving it, liking it, and hating it all at once. Not hate, hate's a strong word, but like being pretty bummed about it. I think I settle somewhere in the like it tier where I'm like, I like it, but I do have issues with it. But I'm not totally in love with it. I'm in love with certain elements of it, but I don't love it. So that's my review for Quiet Place Day One. It's a little bit skeptical. It's a little bit wishy-washy, but that's just kind of how I feel right now. Maybe my opinion will change with another watch. This is only a movie I've watched only once. But I do know there are some lovers out there. I think Chad Webb, co-host of Picture This is his favorite film of the year so far. And I know he's a big cat lover. Maybe that has something to do with it. So if you want to support Chad's love for film and you just want to watch a fun horror film and you like the first two Quiet Places, I think you'll like this one. But if you have similar criticisms to me, let me know down in the comments below what what you thought. And as always, stay tuned for this month. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we'll be giving you a new review every single day based on a movie that came out this summer. This Wednesday, I think I'm going to talk about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes because there's also a lot that is said about that film. So I can't wait to talk about that on Wednesday. Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. It hit Disney Plus this past week, so it's time to talk about it and rip that Band-Aid off. Not that it's going to be a painful one to rip off because I'm very excited to do so. So thank you so much for watching this one. Let me know down below what you thought. Like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff that you do here. And thanks for watching. Bye. Meow. Shh. Quiet.